continuing the conversation about communal society, we're going to talk about one that was very successful. The three that were identified in the last video are ones that were not successful. This one, the Mormons, who eventually are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, led by Joseph Smith, and eventually Brigham Young, will reach success as a community who challenge the norms of society. So, first, to start off, it begins with Joseph Smith, who feels that he's the next Messiah, that he's part of this tribe, this Middle Eastern tribe that eventually is trying to establish the New Jerusalem. And he eventually writes this book known as the Book of Mormon, where he outlines the religion and it basically talks about the practices. So he had a difficulty in the early part of the religion in establishing a safe place for his community because of the different characteristics of the religion. They were often persecuted. So his beliefs were basically the idea of a communal society, everyone working together. But he did change something from the previous communal societies. He wanted to establish the old norms, to have this. He didn't believe in equality. He felt that there has to be a patriarchal society, that there has to be the leader has to be a man, to eventually to lead his people. He also felt that one practice that angered many Americans was the practice of polygamy. Basically, that Mormon men could take on multiple wives, and so that's one of the things that angered or causes persecution in the United States. So he felt that men are superior, women were not, and that he wanted to kind of bring back those ideas that had were kind of being erased. Eventually, he moves to Illinois, where he establishes his community. He rejects all laws from Illinois that eventually causes problems for him. He eventually is jailed for um, for attempting to establish a community outside the United States. At that time, Utah was not part of the United States, but eventually he is jailed, and along with his brother, when he's in jail, he's eventually both of them are murdered. But one of his disciples, Brigham Young, eventually takes does a basically a journey of 6,500 miles into Mexico, especially it's the Utah Territory. And he settles there in the Great Salt Lake Valley, where with the help of as a community, they build farms, they grow. They're a very successful agricultural community, and so this is something that when you look at the Church of Latter-day Saints, there's a faction that develops over the polygamy issue. Um, uh, Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, eventually established the reorganized faction of the Latter-day Saints that does not include polygamy. And even within the group, Brigham Young's group, there's groups that were not part or did not want part of polygamy. So the ideas of the Latter-day Saints, or the practice of communal societies, is one that is successful and has eventually reached them or allowed them to reach 12 million people, 12 million members. So that's a huge number today, and it still exists. And so that's one of the things that you will see is that that's one of those societies that exist in still today that was eventually challenged during that time. So this is a picture of Joseph Smith, and then Brigham Young. And then here in this map, it shows you their trek, where they eventually went from what part to what part, where they eventually were able to settle in Utah. And again, the idea is that through the efforts of the community, they were able to be successful. The second part of this section on communal societies and urban popular culture is urban popular culture. So we'll begin with this first slide on popular culture, urban popular culture. So the growth of cities eventually take place from early 1800s into the mid 1800s to the latter part of the 1800s. A big part of it is both migration and immigration. We all already discussed what's the difference between both of them. So one of the things that you have to think about is basically how life changed in the city for these people that are coming in. One of the things that you will see is that many of them are going to leave because of the dissatisfaction, the boredom that they lived in the countryside, in the rural areas. They felt like they would be able to be more prosperous in the cities. But what they really found was that living in the city, working in the city, surviving the city was very difficult. Um, Mainly because of labor laws that did not exist. Many men were exploited in factories. They worked meager jobs, really difficult jobs for meager pay, um, and just could not succeed, could not prosper because they felt like they were stuck in this cycle of poverty, working in the factories. And it was even worse for women. Women who could not get jobs in factories would eventually work as live-in domestics, so basically like a servant, cooking, cleaning, and all of that. But something that they experienced while they were in the job is that sometimes the master or the owner, their boss, the owner of the house would eventually sexually exploit them. Um, whether it was for him or for his friends, that was something that happened for women. And so really this time period, as you will see and you have seen in your reading, there's a huge change in what is sexual relationships. So something that obviously is not new, but something that arises again in this time period in this location is prostitution. So basically the sale of sex, right? And so one of the things that you see is that it becomes so common, it becomes normal to eventually pay for sexual favors. As you will see, married men kind of see it as that's their right as a working man, and they didn't really care for how their wives would feel about it. They felt like it was something normal. They constantly went to what are called were known as bawdy houses, which basically brothels, and prostitutes were known as public women because they were literally they would advertise their services out in the open. One of the things that they eventually looked into, the leaders of the city, was what is the impact and why are these people doing this. So they found that most of them were because they didn't have a job, they didn't have the resources, so they had to resort to prostitution. You eventually saw that um, over half of them were uh, were over half of them eventually had were at one point domestic servants. They had children with from their bosses. Um, the range of age was 15 to 20 years of age. So these were not good times for women. It was a form of sexual exploitation here in the United States. So one of the things that you will see is that when it was difficult because as you can see, as you heard, the age 15 to 20 years old, you don't really know much about surviving on your own. So living away from home and not having people to tell you what to do eventually impacted the lives of these young people because of the lack of structure that usually parents establish. So that was one of the areas where you see a change, right, in terms of the sexual practices. When talking about urban popular culture, we have to talk about entertainment. So one of these are some of the things that people did for fun. So one of those things were what they had were rat fights and terrier fights, so dog fights. So people bet on those. So that was a type of entertainment for those who eventually wanted to see something more gruesome. People eventually went to theaters to hear the abolitionist lectures. People went to the circus. People went to see the Barnum and Bailey's oddities show. So there was a lot of things that took place. But one of the shows that or entertainments that really impacted society were the minstrel shows. These were basically shows by white actors who eventually performed in blackface. If you have seen recently a lot of white comedians who were eventually who have participated in blackface have been attacked in our current times. So while that they pretty much poked fun at African Americans, they poked fun at on Irish, they poked fun on women wanting to vote, and all of these things. But the minstrel shows really hit a chord with the portrayal of African Americans. So one of the most popular characters, Jim Crow, is basically, they basically it's a racist show because at the end of the day, it showed the superiority of whites. Uh, Whites were not laughed upon, only the immigrants, women, and African Americans. So what you will see is that this group eventually is showing its racist ways. But most importantly is that throughout this time, you're going to see a rise uh, in a want for a reduction in immigration. So the nativist movement eventually erupts at this time. Irish immigrants joined the American Catholic Church and eventually expands their membership. And again, the thing that you have to get from this section, this slide, is really the arrival of nativism and just wanting to keep America non-immigrant. And so that's one of the things that you see is that um, for popular culture, there's entertainment, but they also has some kind of meaning, some kind of impact in the politics of the United States. In this case, the minstrel shows had an impact on the racist ideology that continued in the North, right, and the South. And then you eventually saw the arrival of nativist or nativism trying to end immigration. There were gangs that were formed to eventually stop or attack immigrants. I don't know if you've ever seen a movie. It's called Gangs of New York. It gives somewhat of a portrayal of how gangs worked. So basically, the gangs were the different immigrant groups that had arrived in New York City.